It's the kind of town where everyone waves, where front porches creak under the weight of quiet evenings, and where kids ride their bikes without a care in the world. But what happens when the evil isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but someone living right next door? What if the person you thought was a friend hides the darkest of secrets? And what if the only one who sees it all is an old canine dog, barking desperately into the night, while the world looks away? If you love stories about brave animals who change lives, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Brave Animals. Don't miss a single story where courage, loyalty, and instinct make all the difference. These are stories that will restore your faith in the power of good. Hit that subscribe button now. Frank Taylor had seen a lot in his years as a sheriff, but since retiring, he'd gotten used to the slow, steady rhythm of small-town life in Willow Creek. He spent most afternoons on his porch, a cup of black coffee in hand, his old German shepherd Bella lying at his feet, her ears twitching at every passing sound. Bella wasn't just any dog. She was a retired canine, her coat now peppered with gray, but her instincts were sharper than ever. On most days, Frank watched the neighborhood kids play hopscotch or toss footballs in the yard. The sun painted the white fences golden, and the smell of freshly cut grass floated in the air. The town felt safe, familiar, until the day Frank noticed something strange. Next door in the Reynolds yard, little Ellie Reynolds stood still as a statue, clutching a battered doll against her chest. Her dark hair hung in messy tangles over her shoulders, and her bare feet were dusty. She was only 8, but she looked older, like life had already knocked her down too many times. Jack Reynolds, her stepfather, was a man the whole neighborhood knew. Tall, broad-shouldered, always fixing up his old pickup truck, he had a firm handshake and a loud laugh at the bar down the street. But Frank knew better than to trust appearances. And Bella? Bella knew too. That afternoon, as the breeze stirred the leaves, Bella lifted her head, her ears snapping to attention. Her gaze locked on Ellie, then shifted to Jack, who stood by the porch with a beer in hand, muttering something Frank couldn't hear. Bella let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that prickled the back of Frank's neck. Frank leaned forward, in his chair, narrowing his eyes. Jack glanced up, caught Frank's stare, and nodded. Just a neighborly nod, but it felt forced, tight. Ellie didn't move. She stared at the ground as if it might swallow her whole. Later that night, Frank couldn't sleep. Bella paced by the window, her nails clicking on the hardwood floor. Every few minutes she'd huff, a soft growl rumbling in her chest, and stare out at the Reynolds house. The house sat in darkness, blinds drawn tight, like a fortress holding back the truth. Frank rubbed his face, glancing at the clock. Midnight. He sighed and got up, peering through the blinds. The street was quiet, streetlights casting long shadows, the air still heavy with summer heat. Then he saw it. Jack Reynolds, dragging a heavy trash bag across the yard, his shoulders hunched, his steps quick and tense. Bella's head shot up and she barked, a sharp, urgent bark that sliced through the silence like a knife. Frank's heart slammed in his chest. Something was wrong. Jack froze, eyes darting toward Frank's house. The two men locked eyes across the street, a silent standoff in the glow of the porch light. Then Jack yanked the bag into the back of his truck, slammed the tailgate shut, and drove off down the street without a backward glance. Bella stood at the window, ears pinned forward, her body tight with tension. She let out a low, restless whine, her tail rigid. Frank's gut twisted. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but his instincts screamed louder than his doubts. He glanced at Bella, who stared back at him with eyes that seemed to say, "Don't you see it? She knows." The next morning, Frank tried to shake the unease. He mowed the lawn, chatted with the mailman, even waved at a neighbor walking her dog. But when he glanced at the Reynolds house, Ellie was there again. Standing at the window, her face pale, her eyes wide with something Frank could only describe as quiet terror. Bella whined low and paced, her nails scraping the floor. Frank's coffee tasted like ash in his mouth. That night, Bella barked again, this time a deep booming bark that echoed down the street. Frank bolted upright in bed, His heart raced as he threw on his robe and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was thick and the moonlight cast silver streaks across the lawns. Bella stood by the fence, barking furiously at the Reynolds house. Then Frank heard it, muffled, faint. But there, soft sobs drifting through the night air, carried by the breeze like a broken prayer. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He followed Bella to the fence, gripping the wooden slats, peering into the dark yard. Ellie sat on the ground, her knees pulled to her chest, rocking gently, the broken doll cradled in her arms. Her face was streaked with dirt, and even from this distance Frank could see the red marks on her arms, raw and angry. Jack's silhouette loomed in the window, a dark figure watching from the shadows. Frank clenched his fists. Bella growled, low and steady, like a warning, a promise. Frank knew in that moment that something had to be done, and yet he also knew that in a town like Willow Creek, speaking up could make you the enemy. People liked to pretend everything was fine. They liked their peace, their quiet, their Sunday barbecues and baseball games, but not Bella. She wouldn't stay silent. That night, as Frank sat on the porch, Bella by his side, he felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't just a dog barking at shadows. This was a warning. A call, and whether the town wanted to hear it or not, Frank knew he couldn't look away. The morning sun cut through the blinds, casting slivers of light across Frank Taylor's kitchen table. His coffee sat cold and untouched. Bella lay by the door, her head on her paws, ears perked, eyes watching the street like a soldier on patrol. Every few minutes her gaze shifted to the Reynolds house. Frank couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen the night before. Ellie sitting on the ground, cradling that broken doll, those bruises on her arms. It wasn't normal. But in a town like Willow Creek, people didn't talk about what happened behind closed doors. They believed in minding their own business, and Frank had done the same for years. He stared at his hands, weathered from years of working cases, pulling bodies out of ditches, breaking up fights at the local bar. He wasn't a rookie. He knew the look of a child in trouble, and Ellie had that look, the kind that haunts a man in his sleep. Bella let out a low, sharp bark, breaking his train of thought. Frank's eyes snapped to the window. Across the street, Jack Reynolds was in his driveway, wiping down his old pickup. His movements were sharp, controlled, like a man who wanted to burn off nervous energy. Ellie wasn't anywhere in sight. Frank's stomach tightened. Later that afternoon, Frank decided to mow his lawn, a weak attempt to feel normal. The sun was hot, the air thick with humidity, and the smell of freshly cut grass hung heavy. As he pushed the mower along the fence, he caught a glimpse of Ellie peeking out from behind a curtain. Her eyes were dark, empty, like two hollow wells. It wasn't the look of a shy kid. It was the look of someone trapped. Bella watched too, her eyes locked on the window. When Frank turned off the mower, the street fell into a strange, heavy silence. He could hear the distant hum of a lawnmower a few blocks away, the occasional bark of a dog, but here, between his house and the Reynolds, there was nothing but tension, strung tight like a wire ready to snap. That night, Frank sat on the porch, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. Bella sat at his feet, her head resting on his boots. The air was heavy, the sky a dark velvet with stars pricking through like pinholes. Then, it happened again. Bella's head shot up, her ears sharp, tail stiff. Frank followed her gaze. Jack Reynolds was out by his truck again, hauling a large black trash bag into the bed. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched. Bella growled, low and steady. Frank's pulse quickened. Jack noticed him watching. His eyes flickered, a cold spark, in the dim light. Without a word, he turned, climbed into his truck, and drove off down the street, tires crunching on gravel. Bella let out a bark that made Frank's skin crawl. The next morning, Frank couldn't sit still. He walked Bella down the block, trying to clear his head, but every step brought him back to Ellie's hollow stare and those bruises. At the corner store, he ran into Gary from the hardware shop. They exchanged the usual pleasantries. Weather, talk, Sport scores. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was gnawing at his gut. Back home, as Frank sipped his third cup of coffee, Bella started pacing. She scratched at the door, her nails tapping the wood in an erratic rhythm. Frank frowned, watching her. Bella didn't act up without a reason. He opened the door, and she bolted across the yard, straight to the fence that separated his property from the Reynolds. She sniffed along the ground, her nose working furiously, then let out a sharp, insistent bark. Frank walked over, peering through the slats. In the dirt, just beneath the fence line, something small and pink caught his eye. He bent down and reached through the gap, fingers brushing over the object. It was a child's sneaker, Ellie's. The toe was scuffed, the sole caked with dirt. Frank's heart hammered in his chest. Bella whined, pacing in tight circles. He looked up at the Reynolds house. The blinds were drawn, the house dark even in the middle of the day. Frank felt a weight settle in his chest. That evening, the tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. Frank was sitting on the porch, nursing a glass of iced tea, when Bella bolted upright and let out a deep booming bark that echoed down the street. Frank jumped up, nearly spilling his drink. Across the yard, Ellie stumbled into the open. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks wet with tears, and her shirt was torn at the collar. Jack Reynolds burst through the door after her, a belt gripped tight in his fist. His face was twisted in a snarl, veins bulging in his neck. Frank's heart seized. He moved without thinking. He was off the porch in an instant, Bella at his side, teeth bared, barking with a ferocity that shook Frank to the core. Jack froze in place, his eyes locking on Frank. The belt hung from his hand, the leather swaying slightly. Frank's voice was rough, low, steady. "That's enough, Jack." Jack's lip curled, but he didn't say a word. He turned, shoved Ellie hard toward the porch, and hissed something under his breath Frank couldn't catch. Ellie crumpled onto the steps, her small body trembling. Frank's fists clenched at his sides. He took a step forward, but Jack raised, a finger, a warning in his eyes. "This ain't your business, Frank." Frank stared him down, his breath ragged. Bella's growl rumbled low and constant, her body rigid, ready to launch. Jack pointed at Frank, a twisted smirk curling his lips, then turned and went back inside. The door slammed shut, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet night. Frank felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Bella nudged his leg, whining softly, her gaze locked on the door. He looked down at her, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on his chest. "What are we going to do, girl?" Bella looked up at him with those deep, knowing eyes. Frank knew then that he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, the room dimly lit, shadows stretching long and thin across the walls. Bella lay at his feet, her breathing slow but tense. Frank stared at the child's sneaker on the table. He picked it up, ran his fingers over the scuffed rubber, and felt a cold rage settle into his bones. The silence in Willow Creek was suffocating, but Frank had heard enough, and Bella, she was ready. The time for waiting was over. The air in Willow Creek hung heavy that night, the kind of sticky summer heat that seemed to cling to everything. The sound of cicadas buzzed in the trees, a distant lazy chorus that usually soothed Frank Taylor's nerves. But not tonight. Bella paced by the door, her paws tapping a restless rhythm on the hardwood. Her ears flicked back and forth, alert. Her eyes locked on the Reynolds house like a sentry guarding her post. Frank sat at the table, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, the child's sneaker still sitting there like an accusation. He couldn't shake the images that played over, and over in his mind, Ellie's bruised arms, her hollow stare, the belt in Jack Reynolds' fist. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. And Bella, standing at the fence, barking like her life depended on it. Frank had been a sheriff once. He knew the law, knew the rules, but those rules felt small and useless in the face of what he was seeing. He felt the weight of it in his bones, a low hum of anger simmering just below the surface. Bella stopped pacing and let out a sharp bark. Frank's head snapped up. Outside, In the dim glow of the porch light, Jack Reynolds was dragging another black trash bag toward his truck. His movements were quick, nervous, like he knew he was being watched. Frank's pulse spiked. He grabbed his phone and snapped a photo, his hands steady despite the adrenaline roaring in his ears. Jack glanced over his shoulder, spotted Frank standing at the window, and froze for half a second. Then he smirked, lifted a hand in a mock salute, and tossed the bag into the truck bed. The engine roared to life and Jack peeled out of the driveway, tires crunching on gravel. Bella let out a growl, low and deep, a sound that sent a chill down Frank's spine. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty street, the shadows stretching long and thin under the moonlight. Frank's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The next morning, Frank couldn't sit still. He called the sheriff's office, asked to speak with Deputy Carter, the one guy in the department who still had some sense of right and wrong. Carter listened quietly as Frank laid it all out. The bruises, the belt, the child's sneaker, the trash bags in the middle of the night. Frank's voice was tight, clipped. "I'm telling you, Carter, something's not right over there." There was a pause on the line. "Look, Frank, without a formal complaint or a witness statement, our hands are tied. You know how it works." Frank's jaw clenched. "I do know how it works. That's the problem." He hung up before Carter could say another word. Bella watched him from across the room, her head tilted, ears perked. Frank ran a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble on his skin. His heart ached with the weight of it all. Later that day, Frank sat on the porch, staring at the Reynolds' house. Bella sat beside him, her eyes locked on the same spot. Then he saw it, a small pale hand pushing back the curtain. Ellie's eyes, wide and dark, met his across the yard. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then Ellie lifted her hand, a slow, hesitant wave. Her fingers trembled. Bella let out a soft whine, her body tense. Frank felt something snap inside him. That night, the storm came. Thunder rolled in from the west, low and rumbling, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Rain started falling in fat, heavy drops, soaking the ground in minutes. Frank sat at the window, watching the storm rage, feeling the tension in his chest build with every clap of thunder. Bella paced behind him, her nails clicking on the floor. Then, through the roar of the rain, Frank heard it. A scream. High, sharp, cut off too soon. Bella lunged at the door, barking so loud it shook the walls. Frank's heart dropped. He grabbed a flashlight and bolted for the door, Bella on his heels. The rain hit him like a wall as he stepped onto the porch, but he barely felt it. Across the yard, the Reynolds' front door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Frank ran. Bella surged ahead, barking like a shot fired into the night. They reached the porch in seconds. Frank could hear crashing sounds from inside, furniture being knocked over, muffled shouts. He didn't think. He pushed through the door, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The living room was a mess, papers scattered, a lamp shattered on the floor. Then he saw Jack standing in the kitchen, gripping Ellie by the arm. Her face was wet with tears and she struggled in his grip, her small fists pounding uselessly against him. "Let her go." Frank's voice came out low and steady, but his hands were shaking. Jack's eyes snapped up, wild and bright with fury. "This ain't your fight, Taylor." Frank took a step forward. "It is now," Jack sneered, raising his arm, the belt clutched tight in his fist. But Bella was faster. With a snarl that came from deep in her chest, she lunged, teeth bared, and clamped down on Jack's arm. Jack roared, swinging at her, but Bella held on, her body twisting, her growl vibrating through the room. Frank moved. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, yanked Ellie away, shielding her with his body. It was chaos. Jack cursing, Bella snarling, Ellie crying, the rain pounding against the windows. Frank shouted for help, his voice raw, desperate. Bella held Jack. Pinned against the counter, her teeth sunk deep, refusing to let go. Frank backed toward the door, pulling Ellie with him. She clung to him, her small body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Neighbors started to appear, drawn by the noise. Porch lights flickering on, people shouting. "Call the sheriff," Frank barked, his voice hoarse. Someone call 911. Bella finally released Jack, who stumbled back, cradling his bleeding arm. His face twisted with rage, but the fight had gone out of him. The sound of sirens cut through the night, distant at first, then growing louder. Frank held Ellie tight, feeling the tears soaking into his shirt. Bella sat at his side, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on Jack. She was ready to go again if she had to. Frank looked down at her, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. Good girl. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, Bella had saved a life. And Frank knew, in his gut, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rain had finally let up, leaving the streets of Willow Creek slick and shining under the glow of streetlights. Frank Taylor stood on his porch, staring at the Reynolds house, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The events of the night before replayed in his head on a loop. Jack's twisted snarl, Ellie's tears, Bella's teeth clamped on that man's arm like a steel trap. The sheriff's department had shown up late. Too late if you asked Frank, but they took Jack into custody, at least for now. Frank knew the system. He'd worked in it long enough to know how slippery men like Jack could be. A few calls, a lawyer whispering the right things, and suddenly the whole town forgets the bruises on a little girl's arms. Frank's jaw tightened just thinking about it. Bella sat by his side, her head resting on her paws, her eyes open and alert. She hadn't left his side since the chaos erupted. Every time the wind rattled the window, she lifted her head, ears twitching. Ellie was safe for now. She was staying at Mrs. Green's house down the street, a sturdy woman with a sharp tongue and a soft heart. Frank had checked on her that morning. Ellie sat curled on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her, her doll clutched tight. Her eyes looked a little clearer, but there was still a haunted glaze there that made Frank's chest ache. As Frank sipped his coffee, bitter and lukewarm, Bella's ears perked up. She let out a low whine and sat up, her gaze fixed on something. Across the street, Frank followed her stare. A dark car sat parked a few houses down, engine idling low. The windows were tinted, the driver hidden in the shadows. It wasn't a car Frank recognized, and in Willow Creek, you knew everyone's car. Frank's gut clenched. Bella let out a quiet growl, barely a whisper of sound. Frank watched for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the house. He grabbed his phone, snapping a photo of the car through the blinds. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he wasn't about to let anything slide. The day dragged on, heavy with a tension that made the air feel thick. Around noon, Frank drove out to the sheriff's office. The building sat on the edge of town, a small brick square that smelled like old coffee and tired paperwork. He stepped inside, the bell over the door jingling. Carter sat behind the front desk, scrolling on his phone. Frank walked up, clearing his throat. Need to speak with the sheriff. Carter sighed, setting his phone down. Frank, the sheriff's busy. Frank leaned in, his voice low and sharp. I'm telling you, Carter, there's more going on here. Jack's not acting alone. There was a car outside my place this morning, a dark sedan. Never seen it before. Carter's eyes darted around, his shoulders tensing like he knew exactly what Frank was talking about, but didn't want to say it out loud. Frank pressed on. You know Jack's got connections. He's not just some backwoods drunk hitting his stepdaughter. He's into something. Carter swallowed, glancing toward the closed office door. Frank, you need to be careful. People who dig too deep don't always like what they find. Frank straightened, his chest tight. That little girl needs someone to dig deep. If you're not going to do it, I will. He left before Carter could answer, the door slamming shut behind him. Back home, Bella met him at the door, tail low, her body tense. Frank ran a hand over her head, feeling the tension in her fur. All right, girl. Let's see what we can find. They walked the property line that evening, the sun sinking low, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Bella's nose worked the ground like a vacuum, sniffing with purpose. Near the back fence, she stopped dead. Her tail shot straight, her body rigid. Frank knelt beside her, following her gaze. A patch of dirt, freshly turned. Frank's breath caught. He grabbed a small garden spade from the shed and started digging. The dirt was damp, clumpy, but it moved, easy enough. A few inches down, the tip of the spade hit something solid. Frank's stomach churned. He brushed the dirt aside with his hands, revealing a small, battered lunchbox. He opened it slowly, his hands trembling. Inside were photographs. Dozens, of them children, some looking scared, some looking broken. Ellie was there, her eyes hollow and dark, her arms marked with bruises. Frank felt bile rise in his throat. Tucked in the corner of the box was a small envelope. He opened it, and inside was a list. Names, dates, locations. Bella whined low, pressing against his leg. Frank gritted his teeth, rage bubbling in his chest. He wasn't just looking at a case of abuse. He was looking at something bigger, something darker. Frank snapped photos with his phone, every page, every photo. He wasn't waiting for the sheriff to take action, not this time. That night, Frank sat at the kitchen table, the lunchbox on the table in front of him, the weight of it pressing down like a stone. Bella lay at his feet, her breathing slow but steady, her ears twitching at every sound. Frank stared at the names, the photos, the evidence. Jack had friends, powerful friends, and Frank knew. He'd just made himself a target. But when he looked at Bella, when he thought of Ellie, he knew there was no turning back. He had to see this through, no matter what it cost. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the street. The air smelled of cut grass and the lingering scent of gasoline from lawnmowers finishing their work for the day. Frank Taylor sat on his porch, the weight of the lunchbox pressing down on him like an anchor. Bella lay at his feet, her eyes never leaving the street, her ears twitching with every sound. Frank's phone buzzed on the table next to him. It was a text from Carter. Jack's out, on bail. Keep your head down. Frank's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He stared at the message, the words burning into his mind. Jack was out. The man who had terrorized a little girl was back in the world, and no one seemed to care. Bella let out a low growl, her body tensing. Frank followed her gaze. A black SUV rolled down the street, slow, deliberate. Its windows were dark, so dark Frank couldn't see who was inside. The SUV crawled past his house, past the Reynolds place, then disappeared around the corner. Frank's stomach twisted. He reached down, running a hand over Bella's head, feeling the tension in her muscles. We're not done yet, girl. Not by a long shot. That night, sleep was impossible. Frank lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Bella paced the floor. Every time the house creaked, Frank's heart jumped. The dark felt thicker than usual, heavy with something unspoken, like a storm waiting to break. Around midnight, Bella started barking. Frank shot out of bed, heart racing. She was at the door, her body rigid, barking with a deep guttural sound that echoed in Frank's chest. Frank grabbed the flashlight and his phone, slipping on his boots. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The street was dark, the air cool and still. Then he saw it. The side gate to the Reynolds' backyard was swinging open, the latch broken, hanging loose. Frank's pulse spiked. Bella growled low, then bolted across the yard, her paws slapping against the damp grass. Frank followed, flashlight beam bouncing in the dark. They reached the gate and Bella stopped, nose to the ground, sniffing hard. She let out a sharp bark and took off toward the back of the property, tail high, body taut like a coiled spring. Frank's breath caught as he followed. The night seemed to close in around him, the sounds of the world fading away except for the thudding of his own heartbeat. Bella led him to the old shed behind the Reynolds house. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. Frank's flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing a mess of tools, old boxes, and tarps. Then he saw her. Ellie. She was curled up in the corner, knees to her chest, her face streaked with tears, clutching that worn-out doll like it was her last hope. Frank's heart shattered. He dropped to his knees, reaching out gently. Ellie flinched, her whole body trembling. It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe now. Bella stood by her side, her body pressed close, tail wagging slowly, a low whine in her throat. Ellie's hand reached out, fingers brushing the soft fur of Bella's head. Frank swallowed the lump in his throat and scooped Ellie into his arms. She was light, too light, like a bundle of sticks and bones. They stepped outside, the cool air brushing against their skin. Frank's eyes scanned the yard, alert, watching for any sign of Jack or anyone else. Bella stayed close, ears back, growl, rumbling low in her chest. Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket. He shifted Ellie to one arm and checked it. A text, unknown number. You should have stayed out of it. This isn't over. His blood turned to ice. He looked down at Ellie, her eyes wide and full of terror, and something inside him snapped. Enough. Frank carried Ellie across the street, straight to Mrs. Green's house. The old woman opened the door in her robe, eyes wide with shock. Oh my Lord, Frank. Frank handed Ellie over, his voice rough. Keep her safe. Mrs. Green nodded, pulling Ellie into the house, her arms wrapping tight around the trembling girl. Frank turned back toward the Reynolds house, his heart a drumbeat in his ears. Bella stood by the curb, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the shadows. Frank's phone buzzed again. Another text. Check the shed. Frank's pulse jumped. He glanced at Bella, who let out a low whine, then bolted back toward the shed. Frank ran after her, flashlight beam jittering across the ground. He reached the shed, the door wide open now, and stepped inside. In the far corner, half buried under a tarp, was a metal box. Frank knelt, pulling it free, heart hammering. Inside were files, photographs, and a ledger. Names, addresses, amounts of money. It wasn't just about Jack, it was bigger. A list of names he recognized. Men from the town, business owners, a city council member. Frank felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. Bella pressed close, her body warm against his leg, a steady presence in the storm. He stared at the papers, his breath shallow. This wasn't just a case of one man hurting a little girl. It was a network, a ring. And Frank knew if they were willing to come after him, they'd come back. He wasn't safe. Ellie wasn't safe. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. He reached for his phone, dialing Carter. Get the sheriff down here, bring backup, bring everyone, this is bigger than we thought. Bella barked once, sharp and loud, as if she agreed. Frank looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. We're in it now, girl, all the way in. Morning light crept across the fields of Willow Creek, casting a soft glow on the sleepy houses and empty streets. The town looked peaceful, but Frank Taylor knew better. He stood in his kitchen, the metal box sitting open on the table, its contents spread out like pieces of a dark puzzle. Names, photos, payments, all tied to a web of pain that had been hiding in plain sight. Bella lay nearby, her breathing slow, her eyes half closed but still alert. The sheriff's office had been there most of the night. Deputies had combed through the shed, the Reynolds house, the yard. Carter had shaken his head more times than Frank could count, muttering about how deep this thing went. Jack Reynolds was gone. When the sheriff's team stormed his house, they found the back door kicked open and tire tracks leading out through the mud. He had vanished and no one seemed surprised. Frank felt a mix of relief and dread. They had the files. They had the proof. But the man behind it all was still out there, and Frank had a bad feeling he wasn't finished. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitter smell filling the kitchen. Bella shifted, her ears perking up as Ellie's soft voice floated in from the living room. She was sitting on the floor, coloring with Mrs. Green, who had insisted on staying the night. Ellie's small hands moved carefully across the page, a quiet focus in her eyes that Frank hadn't seen before. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, Ellie was safe. Frank walked to the window, looking out over the yard. The wind stirred the trees, and a bird hopped along the fence. For a brief moment, the world felt almost normal. But the ringing of his phone shattered that peace. Frank snatched it up. Carter's voice was tight, his words clipped. Jack's been spotted. A gas station security camera caught him heading west on Route 12. Frank's pulse spiked. He glanced at Bella, who was already on her feet, ready to move. Stay put, Frank. We'll handle it. Frank ended the call, but the weight in his chest told him that wasn't going to be enough. He knelt down next to Bella, running a hand over her fur. "What do you think, girl? Sit back and let them take care of it or finish what we started." Bella let out a quiet whine, licking his hand. Frank stood, grabbed his jacket, and took a deep breath. "Let's go." They drove west, the truck rumbling over the cracked asphalt, fields stretching out on either side. The sun was climbing, but the air still held a chill. Frank kept his eyes sharp, watching every passing car, every side road. He found the gas station an hour out. The clerk was a teenager who barely looked up from his phone when Frank showed him the photo of Jack. Yeah, he was here. Bought gas, some smokes, couple bottles of water, seemed in a hurry, took off down the old service road out back. Frank thanked him and headed that way, the tires crunching on gravel. The road wound through trees, the canopy overhead thick enough to block most of the light. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, a shortcut for those who didn't want to be seen. Bella's ears perked and she let out a low growl. Frank slowed the truck, scanning the woods. That's when he saw it. Jack's truck, half hidden, behind a stand of trees, mud caked on the tires. Frank's pulse hammered in his ears. He parked a ways back and killed the engine. "All right, girl, let's do this." They moved slow. Frank's steps quiet on the gravel, Bella sticking close, her body low and tense. Jack was there just past the truck, crouched by a fire pit, flipping through a stack of papers. A gun rested on the ground nearby. Frank's heart slammed in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Jack, it's over." Jack's head snapped up, eyes wide, face twisted with rage. Frank took a slow step forward, hands up. "We have everything, Jack. The files, the photos. It's done." Jack grabbed the gun, his hands shaking. "No, you don't get it. You don't know who you're messing with," Bella growled, a sound low and deep, her body rigid. Frank held his ground. "Don't do this, Jack." Jack's eyes darted, wild and desperate. "They'll kill me, Frank. You don't know what you've done." Frank's voice was calm but firm. "You did this to yourself." Jack raised the gun, his finger trembling on the trigger. Bella launched. The growl turned into a full-throated bark as she leapt, teeth bared, and clamped onto Jack's arm. The gun fired, a deafening crack that split the air. Frank ducked, heart racing. Jack screamed, thrashing as Bella held firm, her teeth sinking in. Frank moved fast, grabbing the gun and kicking it away. He pulled Jack down, pinning him to the ground, his knee in Jack's back. Bella released her grip, panting hard, her fur bristling. Frank shouted for help, his voice ragged, echoing through the trees. It wasn't long before sirens cut through the stillness, and Carter's SUV skidded to a stop nearby. Deputies swarmed the scene, weapons drawn, voices sharp. Frank stood, his chest heaving, as they cuffed Jack and hauled him up. Bella sat by Frank's side, her tail thumping once, twice, as if she knew it was over. Frank looked down at her. A wave of gratitude was good, girl. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Frank sat on the porch with Bella at his feet. Ellie played quietly in the yard, her laughter light and soft like the first rain after a long drought. The weight in Frank's chest hadn't fully lifted, but it was lighter now. He watched the sky turn orange and pink, and he thought about the choices people make. The times they stay silent when they should speak up. The times they look away because it's easier. Frank knew he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who decided not to turn away. Sometimes, that's all it takes. He looked down at Bella, her eyes, steady on his, full of loyalty and love. We did good, girl, and he hoped Ellie would grow up knowing that not all people turn a blind eye, that there are folks who will stand up even when it's hard. Life isn't about staying safe in your own bubble. It's about stepping up when someone needs you, no matter how messy or dangerous it gets. Because silence has a price. And sometimes, it costs more than you can imagine. What about you? If you saw something wrong happening, would you have the courage to stand up, or would you turn away and hope someone else would handle it? Thanks for being part of this story. And if you believe in the power of doing the right thing, no matter how small, I hope you'll join us again for more stories on brave animals.